Jonathan has three basic sectors across his career of supply chain robotics: e-commerce and omni-channel fulfillment, and small parcel delivery. He's currently the VP of Enterprise Sales at Nimble Robotics, where he heads up sales and their parcel strategy. He's also been at Dexterity Robotics, where he was focused on automation for the parcel carriers. Prior to that, he headed up sales at Quiet Logistics, a third-party fulfillment provider for e-commerce and omni-channel brands that recently was acquired by American Eagle. He's also worked at DHL e-commerce, FedEx, DHL Express, and UPS across many roles in those organizations. When he's not working, you will most likely find him at youth sport fields and gyms supporting his kids in soccer, football, basketball, golf, and other such sports. He is also proud to be a Clemson Tiger and is always happy to chat about the college football landscape. And I know he's very happy right now. 3-0 it's a great start. And there's the pour over his shoulder. So, Jonathan, thank you for joining us. You want to tell us a little about Nimble as well? That'll be great. So again, welcome everybody. Please put your contact info in the chat. And if you want to also ask a question, catch Jonathan at a pause and please jump in. Or you can put your question in the chat box as well, and I'll monitor that and try to read it for you. So, Jonathan, thank you again.
Oh, Mike, thanks for the introduction there. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me be part of today's discussion. This is definitely a topic that is near and dear to me, both from having, obviously all the companies you talked through and rattled off has been a big part of my career, and then now I'm probably more of a nerd of it than I've ever been, just with so much going on from the tech standpoint. So so from just a quick intro on Nimble, a robotics company that is focused on pick and pack and pick and place robotics. So doing unit level picking within the warehouse to try to really cut back on what's happening with all the inflationary issues and unavailability of labor for that matter, to try to automate a lot of the repetitive motion tasks within a warehouse and, really supporting high volume e-commerce type environments from a fulfillment perspective. So very high level, definitely if you want to see some cool things, check out the website at nimble.ai, lots of fun video of robots moving throughout a warehouse and stuff like that. And I guess just before I get too far into it, I think that, in my vision of this was not going to be a bunch of PowerPoint. Wanted to keep this more of like a fireside chat. So highly encourage folks, if I talk about something that's interesting, feel free, let's stop, let's dive into it. If we don't get through all the topics, you won't hurt my feelings. So we, as Mike mentioned, happy to send it through the chat. He's going to monitor it a little bit for me just so I don't get lost in it. I think there's also the option to do like an action to raise a hand or something on here. Feel free to do that, or just unmute yourself and chime in. The only thing I'll say in that is the type of headphones I use, it's hard for me to hear while I'm talking. So you may have to, shake me a couple of times to stop, but you will not hurt my feelings if I get interrupted. So want to start with that. And I guess before I get fully into it, definitely I'm glad you threw out some stuff about Clemson, although I don't know how much I buy into the 3-0 right now based on the teams that we've played. So we'll see how it progresses. A little nervous about what the season will bring. But anyway, that being said, today, kind of the focus area is small parcel network, pricing, and the future of e-commerce and last mile delivery network. And handful of topics that I will spend a big chunk of time on throughout today. So just to, as you're thinking about things you want to hear, the parcel landscape for 2022, it's a doozy. Even had to update my notes for today, just based on things that happened in the last couple of days across some of the big carriers. So lots going on there. What's happening with technology and automation in the small parcel environment. I have a really good view on what's going on with the past two organizations in the robotics space, and I'll share what I can share in those areas. Also, I think it's important to understand who's challenging UPS and FedEx, or even the USPS for that matter. There's the last couple of years has opened up a lot of opportunity for new age carriers to come into the mix that oftentimes aren't heard about or known about because they might be regional or local. And so I want to make sure I bring some attention to that because of, I think the pricing control and the rigidity that's happened in the big 2 or 3 landscape has really, fragmented the market quite a bit. So there's opportunities there. Also, the last half of my career has been in the fulfillment space, and I really look at making fulfillment being part of the parcel strategy. So we'll talk about ways how that can be done to help drive out and mitigate some of the expenses. And then I see a lot of CFO titles in here and financial folks. So, trying to bring it home for a lot of the folks in this group of, how do we control some of the inflationary costs? I think as you guys have all seen going through your budgets year over year, no matter what the year has been, Parcel has outpaced the inflation at any given year. I don't expect that to change, even though we're approaching double-digit inflation. We'll just see Parcel rise even more to that. So lots on those topics, and so let me just kind of dive into it from in the order of the topics I talked about. So reason I had to adjust the notes, there's been a lot of noise from FedEx in the last week of they've got things going on with their ground contractor network, which is, up until the pandemic, in my opinion, has been a strength of theirs and something that's led the market of having this low cost, kind of flexible, nimble type of network that was branded as FedEx, but wasn't owned necessarily, wasn't direct employed by FedEx, and touted it as a strength. And I think we have been well rewarded in their stock price over the years. But the pandemic changed that, where all of a sudden, the union Teamsters were all of a sudden a valued asset at UPS because they had careered employees that had a pension at stake, that had 401ks at stake, and so they had a much better job of getting people to come to work, stay at work, and continue to do the work throughout all the last 18 months or so. So now we're seeing a lot of noise come up and about where the contractors are trying to organize, not necessarily in the fashion of a unionization, but at least trying to be represented outside of the single and have a collective bargaining type of environment. Hearing things talked about of trying to almost be thought of as a franchisor relationship. I guess that would change their status, maybe give them, and they wanted one of their marquee largest contractors that had contractor groups across 10 states, if I'm not mistaken, was the one leading all of this, was trying to be the voice of it. They severed that contract in the last matter of days to weeks and said, we're not going to negotiate with terrorism, and we're going to break our contract. And so lots of upheaval there. Not to say that they don't have a backup plan, that they can't integrate their networks, but it creates challenge for an already challenged network and an already challenged price point in, their margins have been eroding drastically, and Ground has been bringing that down. And so kind of leads to the topic that I'm sure all of us have seen on this call, where the first time they don't have Fred Smith at the helm, and Raj gets up in front as CEO and is on Kramer right after almost an abysmal earnings report, and gets asked about, do we think there's a global recession going on? And pretty much right away answers yes, which I thought was a little bit over his skis, and we saw the whole market react negatively. And so I'm eagerly waiting to see how UPS responds with their upcoming earnings. I feel like they're going to lean into it and say, we're not challenged. We've done the right things right. And we don't think we're necessarily in a global recession. So it's going to be interesting from that perspective, what's going on. So that's a little bit on the FedEx side. UPS, we're a year out from a contract negotiation. A lot of leverage right now sits in that Teamster group, because of the things I talked about of them creating a lot of value for the business. Also with FedEx Ground in the turmoil situation, there's not enough network capacity for either side to absorb FedEx's volume, or vice versa, especially to absorb UPS's volume. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays. Having started my career there 20 some years ago, I still am regularly in talks with a lot of the drivers and people that I've managed over the years. They're all worn out. They're all overworked. They're all overwhelmed. And so work-life balance is a big issue for those guys. It's not necessarily about pay anymore. They definitely will have a lot of folks that will vote, against it. We're willing to strike if need be. So there are some climate things that go into it. Outside of that, there's been some, I think, positive things that have happened this year in terms of capacity. Capacity has been the big challenge, which gave them so much pricing control over the last 2 years as e-commerce skyrocketed disproportionately in terms of percent of sales. And so we're seeing, really starting around February, almost every network that you can think of has reported less, volume year over year. It's finally flatlined, but we saw several months in a row of year over year decline. And not that it like resetted nasty, but when you had the growth that they had, it kind of feels like 1920 timeframe in some of the sectors and some of the people, especially from an e-commerce volume perspective. So that's a positive thing, in my opinion, for consumers of the parcel, because now it softens things. They've overinvested in the network. They've got excess capacity, which means they're leaving revenue. We've seen it come up against UPS a couple times. They've been still leaning heavily into the bigger, or excuse me, better not bigger mantra. I think it's outlived its usefulness of that business, and because we've now seen multiple quarters in a row where their volume has declined, they still have delivered on the earnings, but I think that's going to start running its course a little bit. So anyway, some things to think about there. I don't know what we'll see if there's a lot of uncertainty in the market. We see a lot of things being talked about across a lot of folks in the retail space, whether it be the apparel sectors, electronic sectors, various things are all feel a little bit soft coming into the end of the year. So it's going to be interesting how Q4 shakes out for a lot of these folks. There's been service challenges for years now. It hasn't let up any time. Most of that still seems to be around labor. They're struggling to get labor, at least in the hub level. And in some of the networks at the driver level. So, we still see a big impact on service. As a result, they did away with guaranteed services in many of the services starting in 19. They have not restored any of them in the ground and home delivery sectors of those businesses, still only sticking to the air side of it, which has been a big negative, I think, to the consumers like us, big positive to the carriers, that they now are not, they're letting the service level slip a little bit. And we've seen that drastically in the USPS side. We've seen that drastically in FedEx. However, UPS has maintained a pretty strong plus 95%, if not above 97%, pretty ongoing. So despite them not having that service commitment, we are seeing service still remain pretty strong in that regard. Several pricing impacts that have happened in 22, multiple rounds of rate increases, especially across the USPS, larger than normal, 1% higher as an average, going from 4.9 to 5.9, which we all know that's not the true number, but that's a significant, if they talk about the blended average being 1% up. And the fuel surcharges are back to like 2007, 2008, 15 to 30 points on a fuel. And they're now more reactionary because several years ago, FedEx and UPS have now positioned it to where they can change that on a weekly basis versus the monthly basis. So they're almost in real time to what we see in a pump or what we see in the news cycle. They can adjust that, and they've made multiple resets to those fuel surcharges over the years that have not boded very well. So, and then the last thing, we just saw the peak surcharges get announced over the last couple of weeks, largest to date since we've added a peak surcharge. I mean, just drastic to where the point where you could be in a situation where your surcharges will be more than your base rates and beyond because of the weight of up to $5 a package for just one of the surcharges. And then if you get into the dimensional side of it and the length side of it and the big bulky stuff, it's even harder hit, and even new surcharges introduced there. So that's I guess a summary of 2022 to date. There's obviously lots more in the news cycle, but let me just pause there. We went through a lot of topics, just rounding out the landscape. Don't know if that brought up any questions, concerns, or comments. Let me take a moment to just see if anybody wants to chime in on those things.
Hi, Jonathan. Dorothy Montgomery. I wanted to just ask what you're seeing in terms of competition. You're talking about FedEx, UPS, USPS, but what are you seeing in terms of competition now?
Yeah, lots of it. And then maybe we'll just shift the segment up here since you asked a great question and we're clean off the other one. There's quite a few things, right? So now the sad thing is they don't have the capacity that we see in UPS or FedEx or USPS for that matter. So it's got to be done incrementally. If everybody were to make a change today, we couldn't do it. So so there is, to the point where they, so regionally, there's a lot of folks that classify themselves as regional carriers, meaning they're covering states, but not national coverage. LaserShip has made a huge move last year where they merged or acquired OnTrack, so gave them bi-coastal coverage with the two networks. Have rolled out this year to do line hauls cross country, so you can ship from their network to go east or to go west, vice versa. They're rolling out Texas, that'll start Q1, which will then connect east and west out of the middle of the country. They're going to expand further in the upper Midwest. They go as far now as Columbus, Ohio. They're going to be opening Chicago markets for 23, as my understanding. So they're starting to really cross into the populous states, at least, and really starting to. I feel like they're the largest, the likelihood, but they are struggling from a capacity standpoint in that they've got. I think in June they stopped taking on new customers for this year, and are now kind of holding the line to see what new capacity they can create. So good and bad. Good that they lock it down so they don't take on more than they can handle, and everybody suffers in service during peak season. But bad if you're not in that network and you wanted to expand, you're going to be boxed out. Now they have a smart commercial strategy in that folks that sign up now that could go live by the end of Q1, they'll keep the 2022 rates in place for all of 2023 and avoid that general rate increase or GRI. So good opportunity there. They come in significantly lower in the service areas that they cover against the FedEx or UPS with a very like service, and typically have more further stretching points of 1 day or 2 day coverage. They get a little bit longer in those coverage areas just based on the way their network is set up. And then you've got some other, and this is one exhausted. There's probably 20 or more true regionals. I'll hit on some of the higher levels. LSO down in Texas, they've been challenged last year, both in service and a little bit of turmoil going on. And I think LaserShip and OnTrack going into their market, could mean bad things for them. They're basically covering Texas and a little bit into Oklahoma and Louisiana, and they don't cover every zip code. They're focusing on the smart zip codes, I guess, probably whether they can kind of optimize and cherry pick and choose the places that are going to make more sense to them, but they don't even cover those full states. UDS in the upper Midwest, you've got a couple more on the West Coast that I'm blanking on as we're talking out loud, a few more popping up on the East Coast. Then what I'd kind of shift into more what I'd call new age carriers that are true asset light, using a tech play, taking advantage of the city-based carrier networks that are out there, some of that capacity that's been left in the wake of Amazon, changing their strategy of getting rid of their flex delivery network, left a lot of these kind of like city-based and regional guys with a lot of capacity that you could tap into. So Axle Hire fits in that category. More of a same day, next day play with regions. So focused around the top 15 or so metro areas in the US. Better Trucks is another one that, depending on who you ask, you could classify them regionally. I push them more to the new ages because the tech component, but they've got a handful of statewide coverages. 1 and 2 day footprint looks same day, but not a lot of same day business. A Canadian company by the name of Swift has been coming down to shake up in that space. They've got a handful of markets, more of the same day, next day type of space. And VHO is another one that took on a huge cash raise last year, expanded heavily, has tried to grow significantly, seemed to be shaking things up in that space as well. Then you've got postal workshare guys, which are not necessarily new, but I think a lot of times overlooked. So folks like DHL ecommerce, who I'm a little bit partial, haven't worked there for so long, but at the same time, I think when they've made that postal product their core product, they try to make it look and feel as best as it can. Versus when FedEx's and UPS's, they don't want it to compete against their core product, so they make it just good enough, but they don't want to lose volume to the postal side of it. So I think DHL's done a lot of good things. They give multiple levels of service, anywhere from a 1 to 3 day product to a 3 to 5 and a 3 to 7 day solution. A very lightweight focus, so 2 to 3 pounds and under is their niche. But where they come in for size and shape products, no accessorial charges except for fuel. Very reliable, highly visible. You've got some up and coming guys like OSM out of Chicago has now added multiple hubs. I think they've got 5 hubs across the U.S. They do a little bit different approach to their network. They are a hybrid of what most of these guys are, which is going into the last mile post office, or they call the DDU. But they also leverage the back end of the postal mail network of the USPS. So they run through the priority mail network in what's called PMOD, or priority mail open and distribute. So they've got some speed components to it. So they're unique in that regard. Former Logistics Network, Pitney Bowes has got coverage in that area. And then even some of the regionals are doing postal injection stuff, taking advantage of that last mile. So those products have gotten fairly stable, highly visible, and much lower cost, because you're leveraging the USPS and their strength, skipping all of their inefficiencies in the front end network, take it down to last mile post office. They give an extra discount if they're sorting it and pre-sorting it down to the 5-digit zip code and to the carrier route level. So we're seeing a lot of the Workshare folks do the pre-sort in their network and taking out some of those error components out of the USPS, using more automation to do that. There's also some folks that have stepped up in the middle mile space. Pandion is something that you should keep some eyes on. Some former Amazon folks that building somewhat similar, I think, to what Prime Network has become, where it's got a asset light hub model, leveraging these city-based carriers, kind of a rate and service shop in line as it goes throughout there. It has kind of infinite capacity as a result of being able to flex it up and flex it down with very good visibility and controls in their network. They're starting to put hubs across the U.S. and launched last year pre-peak out of Pennsylvania. Since have added 4 or 5 hubs to their network. And then Warp is an interesting one in the middle mile space. They're the former founders of Axle Hire, and creating some opportunities with tech, with line haul and visibility, and taking advantage of some backhaul things and flexibility of sometimes you need a trailer and sometimes you need a truck. And so they can flex between a cargo van to a straight truck to a trailer, and everything in between, can give package level tracking for the line hauls that they do, where you can do piece to container scanning. So if you want to run a zone skip with somebody like that, gives you, one of the things that everybody's always worried about is that lack of visibility, or having to put it in an LTL network and losing speed. These guys can run directs, give you the tracking. So opens up some more opportunities. And then there's also some interesting stuff coming out with what American Eagle's been investing in with their acquisition of Quiet, and then also AirTerra. They merged those 2 companies together and became Quiet Platforms. So they're doing stuff with middle mile and even potentially final mile as well. So kind of competing against what Pandion's doing. So definitely lots of competitors that are popping up regionally or locally that you can take advantage of with a little bit of tech work. Some of the good news is some of the TMS platforms are starting to integrate some of the newer guys into it because they are API driven. So, you don't necessarily have to do a direct integration one-to-one, which was the challenge in the past, is that you pretty much had to go one by one. But a lot of the regionals and even some of these tech-based guys are starting to roll up into some of the, at least the more e-com focused TMS platforms like an Easy Post or, various guys like that I see have options there. So, Dorothy, I don't know if that answered all. If you got any more questions on any of the folks I rattled off, happy to dive into it more. Perfect. Anybody else that I opened some questions or some thoughts up for? All right. Well, then I exhausted the who's challenging UPS and FedEx there. Well, I'll skip back up into order where I was going here. And this is probably my most favorite part of it, is the technology and the robotics, and how I got out of the fulfillment space and the transportation space with all the labor challenges that were existing, is because we're just seeing it, right? It's hard to get people to come to work. It's hard to get people to stay at work and stay in the jobs, and turnover is killing the business, and everything like that. So the unfortunate part is there's still a long way away from what we see in our news feed, say on LinkedIn or wherever else we're sourcing information. A lot of cool videos are floating around, but a lot of it is still very scientific and done in a vacuum or a very controlled environment. So there is a long way to go before we get there. But the good news is we're heading there, and there's some cool things happening. So if we look at it, robotics and how that fits into the carrier network specifically, areas like sortation, that's very heavy, people oriented today, and it's also repetitive motion. It's also highly injury prone, high turnover, and that's typically where the fail points happen in the network in terms of a missort, because of people trying to manually sort at a very high rate of speed. So there's a lot of robotics companies investing in there. The carriers are playing in that space and testing out many solutions to be able to put a robot where a person once stood and retrofit. So not needing a new building, but coming into the pre-existing infrastructure, which is important since there's hundreds, if not thousands, of legacy buildings across the carrier networks, to be able to plug something in and be able to get close to human speed, have the accuracy. But I think in some ways it has more accuracy because it has some redundancies and some extra scanning and extra visibility and software to know when it makes a mistake, to communicate to the system, to tell the operators, I put the wrong package on the wrong tilt tray, let it be cycled back out to be corrected. So even though they might not move as fast, there's opportunities for it to make better value. There's lots of things being looked at of trailer loading and unloading, where is tons of labor sits in the parcel environment right now. Again, an ugly job that's high turnover, that's highly injury prone, highly exposed to the extreme temperatures in the summer months and the winter months. And so definitely been an area of concern. Probably the hardest area to tackle because of the speed and how every trailer is different every single time. There's no consistency to how they're loaded. So there's a lot of edge cases that exist, but there's also a huge opportunity to displace. If you think about the number of dock doors you see when you drive by any of these locations, there's opportunities there. A lot of autonomous vehicles, and not two levels of autonomous vehicles, but within the four walls. So using autonomous vehicles where, like, what they would refer to as irregulars, or stuff that could not go through the belts or the sorts. Normally that'd be pushed on a cart and drug around, or maybe using a forklift, still needing an operator. They're using what's called AMRs that are automated mobile robots that can move freely without a track, that uses vision systems and mapping to be able to move throughout. So it's freeing up labor in that area. Same thing on the fork vehicles, using autonomous fork trucks. And then outside, there's what we think of when we think about autonomous vehicles, and they're using them already in like yard shifting. So having to pull trailers on and off the docks, putting that, it's a very, very controllable location, least likely to cause injuries or accidents, but also needs people and personnel to staff in very weird hours, middle of the night type, the early morning work. So again, hard to get people to come out and do that. Also, direct line hauls is the next area that we're seeing announcements of the carriers signing things where they'll have a fixed route going down maybe a very stable highway that is, a back and forth, trying to start in a short distance line haul, and then that will go from there. And then ultimately the holy grail for them is to get it in the package delivery side, get it to where a vehicle can go stop by stop and not need a driver to do that, whether a driver is there just to be able to run the package off, or if there's robotics used inside the vehicle. There's a million and one ways that could go, but all of those things will hit a very labor intensive, very expensive labor situation, head on. Not to say they're going to give money back down the road, but at least should stabilize the rate of inflation as a result of that, because so much of the labor sits in the four walls doing the sorting and the unloading, or obviously at final mile, and that's where the highest rate of pay exists. So lots happening in that space. They're still trying to make drones work. I don't know that that's still going to do a whole lot of good for anybody other than maybe super remote areas or hard to traverse situations. But I don't think we're going to see tens of millions of drones flying overhead anytime soon. The interesting stuff I've been hearing about, though, that is happening and is happening very quickly is in the stop density side of things. And so as both UPS and FedEx both have a postal product, they have been trying to bring more and more of that volume back in from turning it over to the USPS for delivery, bringing it back into to be delivered by the brown or purple trucks, et cetera. And they're using technology as they look down the network and can look over, say, a 5 or 7 day period of time and say, hey, we have a core package coming. If we speed up the postal package, we can marry up, or if we slow down the postal package, we can marry it up and get 2 or 3 or 4 deliveries showing up on one day, because it basically costs them nothing more to take a second or a third or a fourth stop. And that's what, if you watch the UPS earnings calls, Carol's been really, really harping on that about getting more delivery density. There's a not named, but a major e-commerce platform, I think we could all guess who that would be, is to look at the order management side and actually look at the orders before they're picked and packed, and trying to time up order releasing and trying to marry it up. And so this gets really interesting, because if they can make this work, they should be looking. Right now, they see it at best. They see a package at the time you manifest it. So when you've packed it, you've shipped it, you put a label on it, and probably 2 hours from now, they're going to pick it up from your doorstep. You send an electronic manifest about the time they make the pickup, and that's the first they have insight into it. If they now can go upstream and look at it at the order and the unit level, there's a couple things that's happening. Big data, they can understand not only what's coming their way in terms of like boxes, but they also can measure like units and product types, and they can capture all kind of marketable data and become a data house. But if they can look at all the order side across the country and say, hey, I see that Lowe's is shipping and Home Depot is shipping and JC Penney, you name the thing, are all shipping to Jonathan Briggs, I'm going to marry up all these packages and make sure Jonathan gets all 3 packages on the same day. And so it's really interesting. It's going to take a long time to work, but it's an interesting play to have insight before an item is even picked. So looking at the cart level to know days in advance what's coming down the pike, and then what should we speed up or slow down to marry those things up. And if you go back to my comment before, we got rid of ground service guarantees. Now we can speed it up or slow it down without any repercussions. I can add +1 or +2 to a ground package because I don't owe a guarantee. I don't owe money back. You can't file a claim on it. So I think we'll see some volatility happen in the service level as a result of that. But on the flip side, it should drive out costs, and hopefully that means less rate increases year over year. Probably not the case, but it's a wishful thought. But that's something to keep an eye on. That's some things that are coming out this year that can happen now. There's already, like I said, a major platform. My assumption is that Shopify, but it was never stated of who that is. But that's who I suspect who would have the volume and the capability to be meaningful. That's not Amazon, because both the carriers are really, losing steam with Amazon and losing volume share year over year. So try to do stuff outside of that is my take. But again, that's never been stated, and that can't be validated in my opinion. So, well, that's kind of it from what's happening in the way of technology and what I see coming down the pike. Any thoughts or questions? Should I pause there to see if that made anybody think a little bit?
Jonathan, it's interesting you talk about visibility in the fulfillment side, because I think throughout the entire supply chain, there's a lack of visibility in shipments, right? I mean, whether a container is loaded on a vessel to, the time to offload the vessel, all that information, the shippers have no clue. They get the information, like you said, when a manifest is sent, they get notified, and whether it's an offload and then drayed to a yard, to a fulfillment center or distribution center, then sorted, picked, packed, and shipped on an LTL or whatever to the final destination. It's an interesting concept, but the lack of visibility is such an untapped market that so many players are trying to connect, and it's really difficult. But that wasn't my question. I was just
go ahead.
Regarding your the robotics, going all the way back to the beginning of the robotic discussion, you talked about the sortation, the pick and pack. What is a robot cost? If you look at a facility, 300,000 square foot facility, what would a robot cost? One robot. I mean, obviously in this facility of 300,000, they need multiple. What does something like that cost the company?
Yeah, they're pretty expensive today because it's still, there's not a lot of supply chain capacity in terms of the robot manufacturing. Most of the folks in that space are having to use industrial robotics. So the ones that have been around in the automotive industry for 30 plus years that were designed around, spot welding and loading a door, they're very precise. They're pretty slow, but they're also very overly engineered for a logistics environment. So, but that's where it's at. So right now it's people taking industrial robotics, overlaying some form of artificial intelligence and capabilities, a tech stack on top of it to get it to outperform or do different things than it was originally trained to do. Once there's some larger scale contracts and it's less of a piloting or test driving onesie twosie, and that goes up to hundreds and thousands, then I think we'll see some of these software guys become hardware guys and create their own robotic arms. I mean, we in our space have done that in the four wall side. We're a vertically integrated where we're manufacturing the infrastructure, the hardware, the robotics, and then also doing the AI and the platform side all inside. Most of the people though in this industrial side that are working with the carriers are more, like I said. So those robots are to the tune of a couple 100,000 just in upfront CapEx. And then there's also the AI platform that goes over top, and there's a lot of cost there that's in service and everything like that. And so it's ongoing in perpetuity probably has a significant cost reduction, because in the case of a UPS or FedEx, they're going to run probably 4 to 6 shifts in a day because of part-time shifts. So one robot could replace up to 6 people that have a pretty high labor rate, plus have training costs, plus have hourly, have overtime, have benefits, have school education paid for, on and on the list. So they have a pretty high burden labor rate, even at a part-time level that's $30 to $40 an hour. And when you take that almost 24 hours a day, and a robot is probably going to live less than $100,000 a year from a platform perspective, it will pay for itself over time. The challenge is still there is the variability that exists, right? There's high throughput, thousands of packages an hour. No two packages look the same. Variable weights, variable packaging types, from a cardboard to wood to plastic bags to bubble mailers, on and on and on we go. It's variety and variability, which is very hard for the robotics and the vision systems. Everything's an edge case. So what that means is there's a lot of human intervention. We have to stop the sort. We have to unstick the robot. We have to override a loop that it's stuck in because it got in this continuous loop and it didn't know, do I go back home? Do I reach my arm out? What do I do here? Also, a lot of this is used in a small package environment, or excuse me, a small sort environment, which typically means under 10 pounds. If they miss sort and send a 50-pound box in a small sort, all of a sudden now we've shut the small sort down. We got to have somebody come. So there's a lot of this stop, start. So they're not seeing the throughput yet that they would like to see. And so that's why we're still going to throw people at it. But once they can start doing what I said of, hey, one robot displaces 4 to 6 people at a time, we'll see it really take off and really grow. And there's going to be some big winners in that space. And then obviously the carriers, have, hundreds of thousands of employees that could be displaced in that situation, that are every year going up in their labor costs. Their benefits are going up. The fringe benefits are going up. The retention costs, the turnover costs, and they're, most of those jobs are plus 100% turnover throughout the year. And so there's extreme cost that can happen there. So yeah, and obviously it's not sustainable to sell a robot for $200,000 to $300,000. That will need to come down drastically. But that's going to require, like I said, them doing it in-house, creating a logistics specific robot that's lighter weight, that's less accurate, that is okay if it only lasts 5 years versus have to last 30 years, things of that nature, because we're now hopefully buying it for less than 30,000 versus buying it for 200,000. So the unit economics are still pretty challenging. The other thing I would say is nobody knows how to buy robotics. They think about it like any other fixed asset, a conveyor belt, machinery. It should be, I buy it one time and I sweat that equity for 20 years or whatever. That's not the case in robotics. It requires this ongoing updates of the AI and the brain and the capabilities of new skills and new capabilities to keep adjusting to all the changing environments that we talked about. And so that's where like the procurement departments come in and say, I don't even know how to do the math on the ROI and everything, because I'm used to only buying it one time, and then I don't know how to sweat this out. And the other thing, that this is what I always tell people, the most technical discussion I've ever had in the robotics space was not around the robotics. It was around what is your true burden labor rate, because there's so many departments that come into play in the cost of labor. It's the recruiting side on the front end, it's the training side, then it's the P&L for the operator, then there's all the fringe benefits if I'm giving them college reimbursements. So nobody knows what their true costs are, or aren't willing to fully burden it, so that they feel like they got upsold by the robotic sales guy. And so that's where it's challenging, is to get people to say, what does it really cost you to have an employee stand here? So anyway, that's some of it. Did I answer what you were looking for in that question?
Yeah, you did. Thank you. Robert,
I thought you were going to say something too. Yeah.
Well, there's a couple of questions that can be built up or shut down. Of course, you already covered the return on investments of over 200,000 unit over a depreciation of 20 years. It's almost like it's hard sometimes with some of these I will call them distribution centers, to sell them a product like this. And my point is, and I'm trying to work it out, because you throw a lot of information here. It's almost like you said, do the smaller outfits have to be like staged and convinced that every time they buy something from you, it works well, and then they have a relationship, especially if you're in the sales, you want to have a relationship, they have reliable services. I think you have services that come out and to try to resolve their problems as soon as possible. So you covered that. I'm interested in what state is most active for your company's business plan so far. Is it New York, California, Texas? These places could be close to Amazon, huge distribution centers like in New Jersey. So I was just curious where the most activity is for Nimble.
Yeah, so for us specifically, it's the California, it's the Midwest actually, because there's lots of distribution. Ohio is a top state, because so many companies in traditionally have kind of put in that golden triangle between Columbus, Louisville, and Indianapolis. There's a lot of distribution and fulfillment that sits in there. So we're pretty active in the Midwest, but it's everywhere. I mean, there's fulfillment centers everywhere. There's labor challenges everywhere. So it just depends on what people are looking to do and who's leaning that far into it. Now, where we are challenged in our state of what we're building is we need new buildings now. We've gotten out of the retrofit business and doing greenfield environments because of where we've progressed our technology to. And so not everybody's putting a brand new building up every day either. And so so that's to us, and that's not all robotics. A lot of them are still built around coming into a brownfield environment, retrofitting something that was people purposed type of platform or space, and making a robotic arm fit within that infrastructure. And so it can definitely be done.
I mean, for example, the airports, of course, it's luggage, but then when Federal Express, when I see a lot of them in northern Jersey, they must need some assistance on their distribution and how they handle these packages. They just load them up, put into a conveyor belt, and it has to read those barcodes. So I'm the one that looks at, I work with startup companies, and at the same time, I look at what you're saying has a high potential to really help out these organizations. And that's why I was very interested in what your activities were. I know Amazon is, of course, they're changing as you are changing, and other companies are changing because I think their distributional logistics are being changed on deliveries. I get deliveries from a different place where I am now. They might close down a place and consolidate. Like those potentials for sales. And I was just interested in, expanding your thoughts on these other, as things are going. You told about inflation. You talked about the costs, burden costs. And of course, we have workman's comp issues because it's going to be really high, the workman's comp, and they can audit a company anytime they want to and find out you made mistakes, and that adds more costs. So that's why I was asking these questions.
Yeah, no, great question. Great. All right, well, I know we're getting here close to the edge of time. I'll try to skip through here just to touch on a couple of things and then leave it open for the ending questions here. One thing too, I think we also need to think about what we do in our fulfillment world to help us out in that last mile delivery. They do go hand in glove, and there's a lot of things you can do either with the four walls or within the four walls to be able to. Oh, perfect! Somebody corrected me on the time, so thanks for helping me out there. So good. Well, I won't rush too fast, but I'll still make sure we got time to chat. But so the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years now, however long it's been, I've kind of transitioned from Parcel into the fulfillment space of more regionalized fulfillment, distributed order management. So did that at DHL, obviously Quiet, which is now part of the American Eagle family of companies, and even now, where we're at, we're playing in that same space too. And the whole thought process there, the way to think about it is, it costs dollars, it's pennies on the inbound side per unit to bring something into a warehouse typically, because we're bringing in bulk, we're bringing in trailers. When we ship a unit outbound from a final mile distribution, it's dollars a unit. And so even though we do create inefficiencies by going into a second or a third or a fourth or however many node, inefficiencies on the inventory side, inefficiencies on the line haul side, the way that final mile has gone up over the last couple of years and continues to go up, is still offset in most situations by the savings by going in a zone reduction of where your nodes of your fulfillment are. Because if you look at a zone distribution on a typical parcel carrier from zone 2 to zone 8, which is how they measure the closest shipping being in zone 2 and the farthest stuff being zone 8, you've got dollars sitting between a zone 2 and a zone 8. So if I'm shipping from a single node, say Ohio, and I've got to ship 30% of my packages to California, all of that's going in a zone 8. I now can localize to California and make my zone 8 a zone 2 and a zone 3 and bring back $2 to $3 a package without batting an eye. The other thing we do is we open the door to get into some of these alternative carriers we talked about. Now I'm not just dependent on the 3 big national folks. I can get into a regional. I can get into a local. I can now do a whole bunch of things strategically with Rate and Service Shop that I didn't have coming out of this national. So, and then if we looked at the other side of it, I now am more reliable when I'm local because I skip hubs and spokes, I skip air networks, I skip line hauls, I skip weather events. I do a lot of things. I skip all the peak capacity challenges that we see. And so I can solve a lot of problems if I can get some of my inventory spread around the country. It doesn't necessarily mean I have to have 100% of my inventory in 2 locations or 3 locations. A lot of folks have the Pareto curve. We look at it 20, 30, 40% account for 80, 90% of the orders. Let's look at those fast moving SKUs and let's spread those around that are fast moving, have a lot more depth of SKU so I don't run into inventory problems. And I shouldn't have to overly increase my inventory, just distribute it. Instead of having 100% one location, I might go 60-40 or 70-30 or however the information. So that in itself is a very good way of helping, be a zone skip without zone skipping, right? We think of zone skipping as running a line haul and going from the West Coast to the East Coast and then break bulking into a carrier network and getting a zone 2 or 3. But we can also do that with our hub and spoke network of having multiple locations and not have to run these line hauls all over the country. So something to think about. I know inventory, when I talk to brands, have always, especially the more complex the SKU base, the apparel folks, the footwear folks, have always brought up the challenges of it. And I would point you back to, to what Gap has done and what Quiet has done, or excuse me, American Eagle has done. Both have hundreds of thousands of SKUs. They've been able to get into 7+ distribution centers. We look at their earnings call reports, and they talk about how they've decreased their split shipments. They've sped up their speed to customer, and they've reduced their final mile cost by over $1 an order. And so it can be done. Yes, it's more complex, but I think it's worth the exercise when if done right and executed properly. There's also order consolidation. So meaning if you have people that tend to buy from you and then realize they need to buy a second thing from you on the same day, maybe we marry those orders up before we let it leave the door. Let's get 2 packages into one instead of split shipping and stuff like that. And we've seen Amazon do a lot of that lately because everybody, I'm guilty of it. I buy one and I walk away, and then I think of something else. I buy 2, I buy 5 things when I buy one thing, but I buy it in 5 different increments because I want to make my cutoff time for Prime or whatever, and I want to keep shopping. So you've got to come up with technology to outsmart your consumers, or maybe not outsmart them, but to help offset some of the consumer behaviors that you have in there. So you're not just split shipping all the time. There's you can speed up orders in your fulfillment center. So instead of always having to go to a premium shipment, maybe you tell your customer it takes me 2 days to get it outside of the 4 walls. Well, maybe when they order a next day shipment, you front a line by the mode of transportation and prioritize a next day shipment so you can still send it out ground without having to upgrade air. So you can use your waving or your picking strategies to speed up packages within the 4 walls that are more critical to your customer. You can also use things in a backlog environment where instead of shipping just in first in, first out, you might say, hey, I'm going to ship my furthest away packages first. So let's ship to California and work our way back. So my transportation is kind of balanced out and all the orders show up in a time. So there's some strategic things you can do there instead of just upgrading the shipping all the time. Obviously, you can go into Omni-channel. You can ship from store. You can do drop shipping. There's all different ways to do that. There's micro fulfillment. There's metro fulfillment. Whole bunch of different ways you can go into there. But for folks that are still in a single node DC sitting in the middle of the country, like in a Kansas or an Ohio or an Indy or a Kentucky, it might be time to start looking, because not only have costs gone up, but the consumer expectations have gone through the roof. And it's 7 to 10 days is no longer acceptable to get something to the end customer anymore, like it was in 1999. And so we've got to look at ways to do that. So that's it from a fulfillment perspective. I'll hold off the questions till we get to the end. And then just kind of sum this up from how do we control the inflationary costs? I don't know if that's possible, with the rate of inflation of the carriers these days, but it's definitely for 10 years or more has been outpacing inflation. I don't think I see it set up, but I think there's things. We talked about it, some of it in the fulfillment strategy, but we can do things like zone skipping or nearing our inventory closer to our end customer, or we can get them to come in and pick up from our stores, or we can ship from stores. We can do different things. Obviously, if you're single sourcing your carriers, we need to be multi-carrier sourcing, and we need to be leveraging TMS platforms or transportation management platforms to make sound business decisions for us in real time. You can't just set business rules, set it and forget it. It's no longer. When we talk about fees that are variable, like fuel changing by the week, peak surcharges changing at different times of the peak time period, different carriers starting them and stopping them at different times. So you want to also having to have pitch counts of, you can only go to a certain number of packages in the carrier network before they start charging you the fees. So building all of that into a rate and service shop environment within a TMS platform can really, really help you out to get the best. And there's also a lot of things too that are hard to think about, like the dimensional weights and the dimensional rules and surcharges and the zip code based surcharges and all these different things that not all the carriers have the same fees. And so multi-carrier with rate and surcharges, obviously, all the fulfillment network strategies we talked about before are critical. We're starting to see this. Should we start charging for shipping again? Should we stop, telling the lie to all of our kids and grandchildren that there's a thing called free shipping? We all know it's not free. So do we do that? We're seeing that in returns. Do we start charging for returns again? So there's things like that. We're seeing a lot more people charging for outbound, increasing their threshold of orders before free shipping kicks in, and the same on the returns, charging some type of a fee, both as a discourager and also to offset some of the costs that are happening there. And then also we spent a little section on new technologies, new carriers. Lean into them, embrace them. Like, it's okay to try something, and I sold transportation 20 years ago when I at DHL Express, when they first bought Airborne, and people would try us out for 4 minutes and turn us off because we weren't as good as UPS or FedEx. And, sadly, the carrier left the market, and it really impacted us negatively, all sitting on this call. Have a little bit of tolerance, have a little bit of patience, come up with a pilot strategy and small scale volumes, but test it, give it a chance, and be okay if it doesn't work out, and put a controlled environment and figure out what is success, what is not successful. Define that with you and the carriers, and try a crawl, walk, run strategy, because some of these companies that we talked about are going to be the next big thing. Not all of them. Some of them are not going to be good. That's okay. Test it out and try it out. But better to test and try than to say, oh man, 20 years ago I switched from UPS to RPS, or I switched from FedEx to DHL Express, and I got burned, and I'll never do that again. Like, you just can't. The services are too impactful right now. The costs are too impactful, but just do it in a very mindful environment, in a way that is controlled chaos, so that you don't set up your company to fail, and you don't put yourself personally in a bad light within your company, but you put some type of defined time frame of a pilot and what is successful and not successful. And I think you'll be surprised at what's out there, and what that can do from a service perspective, and what that can do from a cost standpoint, and also how does that impact your customer experience, hopefully for the positive. So let me stop there. I've been talking for a long time. As you can tell, my voice is raspy. Let's see, open it up for some questions, whether we talked about them today or we didn't. Hey, feel free to introduce new topics here. Happy to answer questions over the next 15 minutes or so.
Anybody care to jump in? So let me Jonathan, ask. We're talking, we just went through 2 years of supply chain, I don't know, call it hell.
Yeah.
Lineup of vessels on the West Coast, an averted rail strike, which would have just destroyed things even further. I think we have a queue on the East Coast now, small queue, right? In Savannah, Charleston, those areas. Likely a result of the transit, the vessels retransiting through the canal to avoid a potential West Coast labor strike, right? Which I don't believe that's resolved either. Are you hearing from the customers that you're working with about resourcing inventories?
Yeah.
With all this technology and robotics and the ability to store inventory and be more efficient, without labor issues at a hub or at a DC or in a warehouse, are you hearing that from your customers about starting to build up an inventory here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing all kinds of different things. I'm hearing reshoring to nearshoring. A lot of folks going into, say, northern Mexico, going into Canada. There's obviously still some tax gains that happen, but it's, we're now cutting the ocean out of the mix. We can get cross-border a lot easier in that regard, but I don't see how it can't be. I mean, I don't get the luxury to sit and look at all the different cost drivers across all these different things. But when we start looking at the inflationary costs that happen, and even if they were just temporary, what the cost of an ocean container was this year, where it was almost cheaper to fly stuff at certain times of the year versus sending it in there. We saw what, blow out everybody's budget that was on the ocean for the middle of the year. And you start thinking about duties and taxes, and we start thinking about the lead times, how much extra inventory is everybody having to carry just to account for the water and the delays. And you know, and then the lost orders or missing a cycle, missing a season. I mean, that's been the earnings report for this year, is all the retailers that had to write down inventory and just liquidate it because they got out of season because things backlogged. So to me, when I look at all of that, I don't know how you can't make a go of it locally or onshore with the things you talk about, having automation involved, having robotics or other technologies that can help simplify the process, use less people, bring in a higher skilled labor group that's paid more but less of them, that gets a greater throughput, you know, and then the speed to customers and stuff like that. So we definitely are hearing it of people at least getting it back on North America, if not coming back to US. You know, and we also saw a knee-jerk reaction to it in terms of inventory. That's part of the problem of this year, is everybody over inventory, knee-jerking from last year, and then the bottom dropped out of demand, and then they got stuck with a lot of inventory. So there's, you know, just putting inventory over here is not a great strategy. I still think you need to be you know, and it feels like to me, if you localized production, you could be more just in time, and you could be more reactionary to what's truly going on versus being 60, 90, 100 and some days behind what's going on, and already have bought POs, already have them on the water. And now what do? You're stuck. It seems like you would allow you to shut down things or scale back production quicker. So I think we will see some of it. You know, a great case in point is here in Ohio, where I'm based out of. You know, Intel has, you know, made a major announcement to bring manufacturing here to the Midwest. Big multi-billion-dollar project for the state, tons and tons of jobs. So, you know, I think that's a perfect example of one of the biggest, you know, think about chips and all the challenges that created in manufacturing and auto production and everything like that. So to bring that here in the heart of, still, I think a lot of auto manufacturing happening, you know, between here and Indiana and Michigan, and you know, to bring chip production close by is interesting play, and so yeah. So I think there's definitely, we're seeing some of that. I don't know how long that'll last for, but you know, there's still, labor is still challenging, and I don't understand what it's going to take to get people to get back to work again from, you know, from the last couple of years, and all the incentives that were, you know, negatively given out, and some of the, you know, making more to stay home than they were making to come to work. And, you know, that's created some, you know, we've eroded 100+ years of work ethic in an 18-month window. And I don't know how long it's going to take to reset some of that.
Anything else? Anybody? Any other questions? So maybe, Jonathan, I'll just finish it up. Reverse logistics. How can we incorporate robotics and all, I mean, in the reverse side of the returns? Is it doable? Is it even worth it at this time until we handle it on the front end?
I will say it's pretty impossible. It's the area we're least looking at. You know, we'll do things in the trailer and the dock before we do anything in the reverse logistics space. And the reason being is it's not just the repetitive motion component that has it, but it's also the inspection, the quality. You know, some of these, you know, we get into apparels and they're, you know, we have to do odor checks, and you know, there's so many things that I just can't fathom being able to teach a robot to do, and it's doesn't have the density of units that you have on the pick side or an inbound receiving side. So for us, it's a long way off for us. The only play that I could see potentially having some way to do it would be using automated storage and retrieval, so ASRS. That might be a way to at least automate the put away and turn a very dynamically slotted area into a way to, you know, dynamically pick and use it for forward deploying. So if you had a large returns environment, especially in the apparel, some form of an ASRS could solve that. But if you haven't done that in the outbound, your gains, you're doing 4 to 6x units on the outbound side. So I'd say, you know, automate pick before I automate returns. But when you get to that, that's, I think, the place that you could do it and have it make the most sense. Because even then you could still use people to do the, like, at least the inspection of it and the QA stuff, but then get rid of all of that traffic and also the inefficient put away process, and then make it a very efficient picking location.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. Thank you. Anything else? Any other questions? Well, Jonathan, this was a great discussion. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I would encourage everybody to please look at Nimble's website. I was checking it out. It's some really neat automation there, and so I would encourage you to have a look. Our next meeting will be October 17th. It'll be an open forum discussion, so I hope to see you all there. If there's any other questions, anything.
Thank you, Jonathan. It was really interesting to hear.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's always fun to talk shop in an environment like this. So thanks for putting up with me for the last hour and change.
Lots of good information, Jonathan. Appreciate it much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
A lot of thoughts involved in this, so I'll be reviewing my notes, and maybe I'll send you an email on questions. Or
yeah, don't hesitate. I did put my email at the top. You can also easily find me on LinkedIn. Very active on there as well. So if you want to talk shop or ask some questions or whatever, happy to do so. So don't hesitate to reach out. But I think I was the very first one. If you scroll all the way back up to the chat section in Zoom, my email's sitting up there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see it. I'm copying it to my notes. Thanks.
All right, everybody. Well, again, thank you all for joining. Jonathan, this was a great presentation. Thanks so much.
Yeah, appreciate it.